January of 1325, in the frost-bitten plains of Maine, John Williams, a blacksmith barely 22 years old, faced a harsh reality. Life during medieval winters was basically nature's way of saying good luck with that. His soul waged war against a season that spared no one. While fairy tales love to show us scenes of cozy castles and warm fireplaces, the reality for John was more like living in the world's worst freezer. Each dawn taunted him, a cruel test of endurance. When you had to wake up before sunrise in a house that felt colder than your neighbor's attitude, you knew you were in for a rough day. With his meager earnings of $50.00 a month, he could barely afford the essentials to survive the brutal cold. Pride kept him from begging, though starvation loomed. To really put this in perspective, while today we complain about our heating bill, or when the thermostat drops below 60 dF, John had it rough. His cracked hands bled, a testament to winter's wrath. According to historical records, winter temperatures in medieval Maine could plummet to bone-chilling levels, sometimes hitting 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite stalked him, a silent thief of flesh. That's cold enough to freeze your boots to the ground, which actually happened more often than you'd think. The daily grind started before sunrise, with John dragging himself out of his freezing bed to tend to his forge, or whatever tasks needed doing. Each step was a rebellion against despair. One medieval writer noted that blacksmiths would often wake up with frosts on their eyebrows. Talk about a medieval alarm clock. Ice mocked his resolve, a cruel jest. Speaking of beds, you wouldn't believe what passed for sleeping arrangements back then, because their beds were basically giant piles of hay and straw thrown together on the floor. The medieval version of a DIY project gone wrong. In that straw, John clung to fleeting hope. But these makeshift beds actually worked better than you might expect. Recent archaeological studies of medieval Maine homes have shown that these hay beds could be up to 1.5 ft thick. Each layer was a desperate shield against death. That's like having a king-sized mattress made entirely of farm leftovers. John would collect fresh hay during the summer months, storing extra bundles specifically for winter bedding. His toil was a sacrifice for survival's slim chance. Every morning he'd have to shake out his bedding, and boy, could that lead to some interesting surprises. From mice making cozy nests overnight, to bugs treating his bed like an all-you-can-eat buffet, John never knew what he might find. Each pest was a betrayal, gnawing at his sanctuary. One medieval text mentions a blacksmith who found a chicken had laid an egg in his bed while he was sleeping. Talk about breakfast in bed. For John, it was a rare spark of triumph. But the real genius of haybeds was their natural insulation properties. When packed tightly, hay could trap air pockets that worked like nature's bubble wrap, keeping warmth from escaping into the cold ground below. Yet dampness threatened to ruin his fragile haven. John would often layer his hay with whatever else he could find: old clothes, worn-out blankets, and even dried moss. Each scrap was a treasure, hoarded against doom. During particularly cold nights, he'd rotate fresh hay from his storage into his bed, because compressed hay lost its insulating properties over time. The downside: haybeds were basically giant sponges for moisture. In the damp Maine climate, they could get pretty musty, and if you had allergies, well, let's just say antihistamines weren't exactly available at the local apothecary. The stench was a foe, sapping his spirit. One historical account describes a nobleman who had to spend a night in a blacksmith's home, and complained for weeks about how the hay bed made him sneeze so much he thought his nose would fall off. John endured it, his pride a silent shield. But haybeds weren't just for sleeping. They doubled as seating during the day. When visitors came over, if they ever did, everyone would sit around on these hay piles, like they were medieval beanbags, though I doubt anyone was calling them rustic back then. Each guest deepened John's lonely resolve. And while these beds might sound uncomfortable, at least they had one advantage over modern mattresses. Bedbugs preferred fabric to hay, but there was one material that John practically lived in during winter. Yes, it's wool. It was basically the medieval version of a superhero suit, except instead of fighting crime, It fought hypothermia. Wool was his armor, fragile yet fierce. John relied on wool so much that historians estimate a single blacksmith might have owned up to 15 pounds of wool clothing. Each thread was a lifeline, woven with desperate hope. That's about the weight of a small dog, except this dog kept you warm and occasionally made you itch like crazy. The fascinating thing about wool was how John got it. Each spring, local shepherds would shear their sheep, and John would buy or trade for the raw wool. Every trade was a battle, pride bartered for survival. But here's where it gets interesting. He didn't just throw it on like we do with modern wool sweaters. The wool had to be processed, which meant hours of cleaning, carding, and spinning, and you thought doing laundry today was a pain. His raw hands spun dreams of warmth. Here's a fun fact that'll make you appreciate your modern clothes. Medieval wool still contained lanolin, the natural oil from sheep that made the fabric water-resistant. Sure, it smelled like wet sheep when it rained, but at least the water rolled right off. John figured out that leaving extra lanolin in the wool meant he stayed drier, though he probably wasn't winning any medieval fashion contests or getting invited to the governor's mansion for dinner. The stench was his badge of defiance. But John rarely washed his wool clothes, and for once he actually had a good reason. Wet wool in freezing temperatures? That's a recipe for becoming a human popsicle. To wash was to tempt fate. One medieval record tells of a blacksmith who washed his wool coat in winter and found it frozen solid enough to stand up on its own. After that, it became a local joke, as stiff as John's winter washing. The jest cut deep, a wound to his pride. But the wool wasn't perfect. For one thing, it attracted fleas like nobody's business. John would often hang his wool clothes near the smoke from his forge, hoping the smoke would drive away the tiny unwanted wood. Each flea was a torment, draining his strength. The downside? He ended up smelling like a combination of sheep and campfire medieval blacksmith perfume, if you will. The magic of wool showed up during the worst winter storms. While modern tests have shown that wet wool can still keep you warm, even when soaking wet, maintaining about 75% of its insulating power. John didn't need scientists to tell him this. He lived it. Each storm tested his unbreakable will. He trudged through snowstorms looking like a walking haystack, wrapped in layer after layer of the stuff. But one piece of wool clothing was never enough in the brutal Maine winters. John had a solution that would make any modern fashionista cringe, because in the medieval world, the fashion motto was simple: if you can still move your arms, you haven't put on enough clothes yet. His layers were a prison, yet his salvation. John didn't just wear layers. He mastered the art of looking like a walking closet. Each garment was a vow to defy death. Archaeological evidence from medieval Maine sites shows that the average blacksmith would wear between 3 to 6 layers of clothing during the coldest days, which probably made him look like he'd raided every clothesline in the village. Let's break down this medieval fit extravaganza. First came the base layer, a long linen shirt that reached down to his knees. It chafed, a relentless irritation. On top of that, he'd add a wool tunic, then another tunic, because why stop at one? Followed by a jerkin, that's just a fancy name for a sleeveless jacket. Each piece weighed him down, a burden he bore. If he was lucky enough to own one, he'd throw on a fur-lined cloak. The whole ensemble was often tied together with a rope belt, which was less, but getting dressed was like a daily workout. One medieval account describes a blacksmith who got so tangled in his layers that his wife had to roll him around the room like a burial until he popped free. And you thought putting on skinny jeans was hard. John was actually onto something with all these layers. Modern scientists have found that multiple thin layers trap warm air better than one thick layer. But each layer was a gamble, risking exhaustion. John figured this out through trial and error, mostly error probably, and a lot of frozen toes along the way. The real challenge came when nature called. With all those layers, a quick trip to the outhouse turned into an epic adventure. Each unfastening exposed him to winter's bite. Records from the time mention people avoiding drinking water in winter just to skip the whole undressing-redressing ordeal. Talk about dedication to staying warm. Kids had it especially tough. Parents would wrap them in so many layers that they'd waddle around like tiny drunk penguins. One medieval writer joked that you could always spot the children in winter. They were the round bundles rolling down the village hills because they couldn't bend their knees to walk properly. Their laughter was John's only warmth. Even with all these layers, John still needed something else to keep warm. That's where the most important feature of any medieval home came in. A feature that could either save your life or fill your lungs with smoke. A fireplace, if you could even call it that. Really, it was just a fire pit in the middle of the room with smoke going wherever it pleased. The flames were both savior and traitor. Medieval architects hadn't quite figured out the whole chimney thing yet, which meant most homes had a lovely ambiance of constantly smoked meat, including the people inside. Archaeological digs have revealed something interesting. The average medieval home had a fire pit about 2.5 ft in diameter, surrounded by stones, but only about 10% of the heat actually stayed in the room. The rest vanished, mocking John's effort. The rest went straight up through the holes in the roof, which were supposed to let the smoke out, but mostly just let snow in. John basically invented the world's most inefficient heating system. The fun started when it came to finding fuel. Forget nice dry firewood. That was for the rich folks. John scavenged like a desperate warrior. John burned whatever he could get his hands on. Old furniture? In the fire. Last year's broken tools? Perfect fuel. Your neighbor's fence that mysteriously disappeared overnight? Hey, what happens in medieval Maine stays in medieval Maine. Records from one New England village show that a group of blacksmiths once burned an entire abandoned barn, piece by piece, throughout a particularly harsh winter. John's role sparked whispers of betrayal. The local governor wasn't too happy about that one. Getting the fire started each morning was a whole adventure. John would keep a single coal alive overnight, buried in ashes. His glow was his fragile hope. Losing it meant a very cold trek to borrow fire from a neighbor. One medieval story tells of a man who had to carry a hot coal home in a hollowed-out turnip because he had nothing else to transport it in. He ran so fast to keep it alive that people thought he was being chased by demons. John ran with the same desperate fire. The smoke was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, it made everyone's eyes water and probably took years off their lives, but it also kept the bugs away and accidentally preserved the roof beams. It choked his dreams, a relentless foe. Modern analysis of surviving medieval timbers shows they were actually protected by the layers of soot that built up over years. It's probably not a preservation method you'll find in today's medieval. John had his own tricks for managing the fire. He'd sleep in shifts to keep it going through the night, or develop elaborate systems of banking the coals just right. Each spark was a defiant prayer. Many believed that if you whispered to the fire while adding fuel, it would burn better, though that might have just been the smoke making him a bit loopy. After a long day of trying not to freeze or suffocate from smoke, John needed something to warm his insides too. His dinner menu? Medieval winter meals were like playing a really weird version of What's in the Pot. Each meal was a desperate gamble. Research shows that the average blacksmith family had about 6 to 7 basic ingredients they used all winter long, and most of them were root vegetables that looked like they'd been grown in a dragon's garden. Turnips, parsnips, and something called neeps, which honestly sounds more like a medieval disease than a vegetable, were the stars of the show. The cooking process was pretty much the same every day. Throw everything into a pot, add water, and pray it turns into something edible. John stirred with weary resolve. This pot would hang over the fire all day long, with John tossing in whatever he could find. Historians have found records of some truly creative additions: tree bark for fiber, pebbles for minerals, and even leather for protein. One medieval record mentions a family who got so desperate they tried cooking their wooden spoon, claiming it added flavor. But John was surprisingly clever with his winter food storage. His cunning defied hunger's grip. He'd preserve everything he could during summer and fall. Vegetables were packed in sand or stored in cool, dark places. Meat, when he could get it, was heavily salted or smoked. John became so good at food preservation that his neighbors would offer to trade for his expertise. 2 turnips for his secret meat smoking technique was apparently a real bargain back then, but their envy bred dangerous whispers. But it's also interesting how he used wild herbs and plants. John was like a walking encyclopedia of edible plants, knowing exactly which winter herbs could make his stews taste better, or at least mask the taste of that 3-day-old mystery meat. Each herb was a small victory. One popular herb was something called poor man's pepper, a plant that grew wild and could make even a boot taste decent if you used enough of it. But the winner of winter cooking were the herbs John dried during summer. Every house had bundles hanging from the rafters, making the place look like a medieval apothecary. These were his lifeline, guarding against despair. These weren't just for flavor. Many had medicinal properties that helped fight off winter illnesses. Though given how much smoke John was breathing in from his forge, he probably needed all the medicinal help he could get. At night, John would gather around his perpetual stew pot, sharing the day's gossip and trying not to think about what might be floating in his dinner. Each bite was a refusal to yield. But he wasn't alone in his cozy home. He had some unexpected roommates keeping him warm. These beasts were both allies and burdens. Studies of medieval house layouts show that up to 25% of living space was shared with animals during winter. That's right. Chickens, pigs, sheep, and even cows became temporary indoor roommates when temperatures dropped. These animal arrangements weren't random. Each creature had its own special heating property. Cows, for example, could generate as much heat as a small forge, around 4,500 BTUs per hour. Their warmth was a gift, their stench a curse. John didn't know what BTUs were, but he knew that sleeping near Bessie the cow meant waking up with all his toes still attached. Pigs were like portable heaters, chickens were feathered foot warmers, and sheep were basically walking blankets. Of course, this setup came with some interesting challenges. You haven't experienced true chaos until you've tried eating dinner with a curious pig trying to stick its snout in your bowl. Each intrusion tested John's fraying patience. Archaeological evidence shows that many blacksmiths' homes had low barriers built to keep animals in certain areas, though based on historical accounts, these barriers were more like polite suggestions that the animals completely ignored. The nighttime symphony was something special too. Between the cows mooing, the pigs snoring, and the chickens' random midnight announcements, John probably invented sleeping through noise out of pure necessity. Their noise drowned his weary thoughts. One funny account from a traveling merchant describes staying at a blacksmith's house and being convinced the rooster had a personal grudge against him. It kept crowing directly in his ear every time he dozed off. But these animal roommates served multiple purposes. Besides being living heaters, they provided an early warning system against thieves trying sneaking past a paranoid goose. Their vigilance was John's shield, and their breath helped keep the room humid, which actually made it feel warmer. Scientists have confirmed that a properly humid room feels 2 to 3 degrees warmer than a dry one. John might not have known the science, but he knew it worked. He even developed specific housing rules for his animals. Chickens might get the window spots to catch the first light and wake everyone up, while larger animals stayed near the back wall, where their body heat could reflect off the stone. Each rule was a desperate strategy. It was like a medieval version of a homeowners association, just with more manure to deal with. As clever as these indoor arrangements were, John still needed to protect himself from the brutal winter weather when he ventured outside. Each step was a defiance of death. His solution? He turned his home into a mini fortress against the cold using some pretty creative building techniques. Because John took his typical medieval house, cut it in half, and buried the bottom part underground. This was his bastion against winter's fury. This clever design provided extra insulation, keeping the cold at bay while he huddled inside. Archaeological digs have uncovered evidence that nearly 35% of blacksmith homes in New England were partially submerged in the earth. These shovelful was a vow to endure. These weren't exactly luxury basement apartments, but John was onto something incredibly smart. The ground temperature stays pretty steady at about 45 to 50 DEF once you get a few feet down. Modern scientists call this geothermal stability, but John just called it common sense. He'd dig down about 2 to 3 feet, build his walls up from there, and end up with a home that stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer. Each stone was a hard-won triumph. It was like having medieval air conditioning, minus the air and the conditioning. Building materials were whatever John could get his hands on: straw, mud, stones, wood. If it could make a wall, he used it. John would steal stones from old native ruins, leading to houses that were part medieval hovel, part ancient empire. Each theft risked the governor's wrath. The local governor wasn't thrilled about this architectural recycling program, but hey, when you're freezing, a stone. The really clever bit was how John handled drafts. Every crack and gap was stuffed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Each seal was a victory against the cold. This medieval caulking worked surprisingly well. Tests on reconstructed houses show it could reduce heat loss by up to 50%. Plus, it gave new meaning to the phrase, "This place is a dump." Doors were another fascinating feature. Most blacksmith homes only had one door, and it usually faced away from the prevailing wind. This was John's stand against the storm. This wasn't just random. It was medieval engineering at its finest. John would often build a small entrance tunnel, kind of like what you'd see in an igloo. One medieval described it as entering through a dragon's throat, though given the smells from all those indoor animals, that might not have been far off. The roofs were layered like the world's thickest sandwich: branches, straw, more branches, more straw, and sometimes even chunks of turf. Each layer was a desperate plea. In some places, John would let grass grow on his roof, not because he was trying to create medieval green architecture, but because the roots helped hold everything together. Plus, his goats could graze up there if they were feeling adventurous. A well-built house was only half the battle against winter's fury. To venture outside, John needed a special set of tools that would make modern survival experts jealous. And boy, did he have an arsenal. Archaeological finds show that the average blacksmith owned about 5 to 7 essential winter tools, each one carefully maintained and passed down through generations. These were his weapons in a brutal war. These weren't just tools. They were the difference between life and turning into a human icicle. The snow shovel was the king of winter tools, but it looked nothing like what we use today. Made from a single piece of hardwood with a wide, flat end, these medieval shovels were actually more efficient at moving heavy snow than modern plastic ones. Each scoop cleared a path to survival. Tests on recreated medieval shovels show they could move about 25% more snow per scoop. Of course, they also weighed about as much as a small dog, so using one was like doing CrossFit medieval style. Thick socks were worth their weight in silver, literally. Records from one medieval market show that a pair of well-made winter socks could cost as much as a piglet. They were John's rare comfort. These weren't your basic wool socks either. John would weave strips of rabbit fur between the wool layers, creating nature's own winter boots. One medieval writer complained that his feet were so warm in these socks, he worried they'd cook. The most fascinating tool was something called a snow scorer, a long stick used to mark paths in deep snow. Each stick guided John through chaos. John would plant these sticks along common routes before big storms hit. Smart move, considering getting lost in a Maine snowstorm meant playing a very cold version of hide-and-seek that nobody wanted to win. Historical records mention one village that painted their snow scorers with different colors of berry juice to create the world's first medieval GPS system. But the real MVP of medieval winter gear was the humble mitten. Not gloves, mittens. These guarded John's hands from winter's bite. John discovered what scientists only proved centuries later: keeping your fingers together generates more warmth than separating them. These weren't store-bought mittens either. John would stuff them with everything from dried moss to chicken feathers. One creative soul even made mittens stuffed with cat hair. Talk about recycling. The tools had to be ready at a moment's notice. Each was a lifeline in the storm. Medieval weather forecasting consisted mainly of looking at the sky and hoping for the best. John did have some surprisingly accurate prediction methods, though. If the cows in the house, remember them, started getting extra cuddly, a storm was coming. When the pigs gathered extra straw, cold weather was on the way. These were John's oracles, his only guide. It wasn't exactly the Weather Channel, but it worked. These clever medieval solutions show just how resourceful John Williams could be when survival was on the line. His defiance carved a legacy in Frost, from underground houses to animal roommates, from perpetual stews to fur-lined socks. This young blacksmith wrote his own survival guide, one freezing winter at a time. His saga endures, a testament to unyielding will,